Brooklyn, 1965. It was the kind of morning that felt too quiet for a city like New York. The street outside Joe Colombo's modest Bensonhurst home looked like it hadn't moved in hours. A car passed slowly, tires hissing on wet pavement. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and stopped. The sun hadn't cracked through the clouds yet, and the smell of last night's rain still clung to the sidewalks. Joe sat by the window, black coffee in hand, wearing the same pressed white undershirt he wore every morning. No rings, no show, just a man who kept his rituals tight, like his business. His wife, Lucille, moved quietly in the kitchen behind him, never asking questions. She didn't have to. She knew what kind of men didn't speak first thing in the morning. The silence in Joe's house wasn't awkward. It was practiced, earned. A few miles away, in Manhattan, the 5 families were already on fire. Tensions, arrests, and whispers of informants, like smoke rising before the blaze. Joe wasn't supposed to be the boss, not yet. That seat belonged to Joe Profaci once, a man with a tight grip on the Colombos before the family even carried the name. But Profaci was dead, and the interim boss, Joe Magliocco, had tried to play a hand that didn't belong to him. He made a move on Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, a stupid, greedy move, and it nearly got him killed. That mistake cracked the door open. Colombo walked through it, not with bullets, not with bodies, but with timing. J. Edgar Hoover had just gotten a taste of wiretaps. The FBI was heating up. Politicians were lining up to make their names by sinking Mafia cases. Colombo knew what was coming, and he didn't want to be the next man on a wire. So he played it different. He started to talk about America, freedom, civil rights, things no one ever expected from a man with blood on his hands and cash stacked in the walls. It started small, a few quiet meetings, a couple of donations here and there. But by 1969, Joseph Colombo wasn't just running rackets. He was founding the Italian-American Civil Rights League, right in the middle of a time when Black Americans were marching, getting jailed, beaten, and buried for similar words. Some said he was protecting the mob, using the League as a shield. Others believed he actually gave a damn. After all, his people were still being treated like second-class citizens. He didn't like the word Mafia tossed around like garbage on every headline. He didn't like watching his sons followed home from school. But not everyone in the underworld liked Colombo's little public project. Too much attention, too much press, and way too much exposure. He was stepping out of the shadows in a business that only survived in the dark. In that quiet Bensonhurst kitchen, Joe stirred the coffee in his cup without drinking. The spoon tapped lightly against ceramic. He was thinking about the meeting that afternoon. Civic Center, Manhattan, a press event. He was going to stand in front of cameras again, speak to reporters, shake hands with people who normally wouldn't have looked twice at a Colombo. He was going to tell them that Italian Americans were being harassed, that there were no mafia bosses, just hard-working men with immigrant blood trying to live. The truth? It didn't matter if he believed it. What mattered was how loud he said it, and who listened. Lucille walked over, kissed the top of his head, and sat beside him. Her eyes lingered on his face a moment longer than usual. "You sleep okay?" Joe didn't answer right away. He looked past the window, into the gray morning. "Not really," he said finally. She nodded. Neither of them said the word. War. But it was coming. The Civic Center was crawling with suits. Some carried cameras, others carried notebooks and microphones, and a few, dressed too plain, too polished, carried nothing at all. The kind of men who asked no questions but always remembered faces. Federal men. Hoover's men. Joe Colombo stepped out of his black Cadillac like he owned the city. Not fast, not slow, measured. His suit was gray, double-breasted, custom-cut, not flashy, but tailored like armor. His shoes gleamed under the overcast sky, and as he walked toward the podium set up on the stone steps, he passed a line of policemen who didn't look at him, not out of fear, but out of habit. Some of them had taken money from Joe's people. Some still did. Most of them just didn't want to get involved. Cameras clicked. A reporter shouted something about the commission. Another asked if he was replacing Joe Bonanno. Colombo didn't flinch. He reached the podium, cleared his throat, and adjusted the microphone like he'd done it 100 times before, even though this was only his third time speaking publicly. The crowd was bigger this time, more press, more curiosity, and more enemies in the shadows. "I'm Joseph Colombo," he said, voice steady but not loud. "I'm a proud American, a proud Italian American, and I'm here today not to talk about organized crime. I'm here to talk about organized discrimination." That word hit the air like a warning shot. "Every time a paper mentions an Italian man getting arrested," Joe continued, "they throw in the word Mafia, whether or not there's any proof. Every time one of us is investigated, the word mob is used before the facts are even out." He paused, letting it hang. "They call that journalism. I call it prejudice." There was a silence in the crowd that wasn't awkward. It was sharp, like everyone was waiting to see if this was a joke, if a known mobster was really going to play the civil rights card, and not in secret, out loud, on government steps. But Joe didn't blink. He looked comfortable, like this wasn't about politics or publicity, like it was personal. And in some ways, it was. His son had been pulled over and questioned 3 times in the last month, not for doing anything, just for driving the wrong car with the wrong last name. Joe's mail had been opened, his phones tapped. His mother, a woman who still cooked Sunday dinners for 20 without blinking, had cried when she saw his name in the paper next to the words mob kingpin. "I am not a criminal," Joe said calmly. "I am a businessman, a father, a husband, and I've had enough of the lies." Back in Brooklyn, the families were already grumbling. Gambino was watching closely. He didn't like the heat. Lucchese, always careful, always calculating, warned his captains not to be seen with Colombo too publicly. He didn't say it out loud, but the message was clear. He's going to bring attention. That gets people killed. Some wanted Joe gone already, not just demoted. Gone. But Colombo wasn't stupid. He knew what this was doing to the streets. The rank-and-file guys, the soldiers, the captains, were divided. Some admired Joe, saw him as a bold voice in a country that never respected the Italian name. They were tired of pretending. Tired of hiding behind Dellas and dry cleaners and fake construction jobs. But the old guard, they saw it as betrayal. "We survive because we stay quiet," they'd say. "He's making us visible, and visible gets you dead." That night, Joe met with 2 of his captains in a small social club on the edge of Red Hook. The place wasn't marked, but everybody knew it. Smelled like cigars, garlic, and sawdust. The windows were blacked out, the door always locked from the inside. They played cards for the first 20 minutes, not talking business. That was the rule. Until the drinks came out and the music got a little louder. Tony Bellomo, an old-school guy with eyes like stone and a voice that never changed pitch, was the first to speak. "You really think this civil rights thing is smart?" he asked without looking up from his cards. "They're calling you a clown in the Bronx." Joe didn't smile. "I'm not looking to impress the Bronx." Tony laid down his cards. "No, you're looking to make yourself a goddamn celebrity? That's what this is." "You think I like this attention?" Joe replied. "You think I want my mother seeing my face on the news next to the word syndicate?" Tony leaned forward. "I think you like hearing your name. I think you like pretending this is about respect when it's about control." There was a long silence. Joe picked up his glass, took a sip. "Let me tell you something, Tony," he said quietly. "My father, he worked himself into an early grave trying to keep our name clean. And what did that get him? A bullet in the back of the head from a man who owed him money. No trial, no press, just dirt." Tony's mouth tightened, but he didn't speak. "So yeah," Joe continued, "maybe I like hearing my name. But if that name gets treated like dirt, if it means nothing but mob, then what's the point? What are we building? A legacy or a prison?" By the end of that week, the league was gaining real traction. Flyers went out, rallies got bigger, donations started coming in, some clean, some not. Italian-American business owners, bakers, barbers, restaurateurs, lined up to support the cause. The league offered them protection, not just from the law, but from the stigma. Joe made appearances, gave interviews, always with the same line: "We are not gangsters, we are Americans." But behind the scenes, the machinery of the underworld kept grinding. Rackets had to be run, debts collected, territories managed. Joe never walked away from that, not for a second. He was still the boss. He still gave orders to hurt people. He still sanctioned hits when it was necessary. The difference? Now he had a microphone in one hand and a gun in the other, and people were starting to notice. The FBI had a boardroom wall filled with pictures of Colombo, photos of him at rallies, at funerals, in restaurants with known associates, in parking lots with briefcases, in church with his mother. They couldn't decide what he was. Was he a frontman, a genius, a madman? Was the League a shield, a scam, a real movement? No one could agree. All they knew was that Colombo was moving fast, and that made him dangerous. Agents were assigned to tail him 24/7, wiretaps were planted, bugs installed, but the man didn't slip. He was careful, smart, paranoid in the right ways. Back home, Lucille watched her husband become something she didn't recognize. He wasn't violent, not to her, never was. But he was distant. He'd stay up all night sometimes, pacing the kitchen, muttering to himself. He'd have meetings in the garage, the doors closed, voices low. The phone would ring and he'd step outside before answering. He didn't tell her much, but she felt it, in his eyes, in the way he kissed her cheek but never really looked her in the face. She once asked him why he was doing all this. He said, "Because if we don't tell our story, someone else will, and they'll tell it wrong." But telling the story came at a price. The Colombo family was under a microscope. Businesses slowed. Some guys left the crew, afraid of the exposure. Others got reckless, thinking they were untouchable because their boss was on TV. And in the other families, rumors started growing teeth that Colombo was cooperating, that he was turning legit, that he had a deal with the feds. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter in that world. Perception was power, and Joe was losing control of his. One night, around 2 a.m., Colombo stood alone outside the League's Midtown office, staring up at the lit windows. He lit a cigarette, let the smoke curl around his face. A Blacktown car pulled up to the curb, and a man stepped out, tall, quiet, wearing a fedora that shaded most of his face. Joe didn't turn. "I told you never to come here," he said. The man spoke with a thick accent, Sicilian. "I'm not here for talk. I'm here with a warning." Joe flicked the ash off his cigarette. "You got 1 minute. Your friends," the man said softly, "are starting to think you're not on their side anymore." Joe finally turned to look at him. "I'm on my side," he said flatly, "like everybody else." The man nodded. "Then you better watch it, because the ground's moving, and when it shifts, the first thing that cracks is the name." Joe said nothing. The man got back in the car and drove off. Joe stayed there, smoking, watching the city. He didn't flinch, but he felt it. The cracks had started, and they weren't just in the streets, they were in him. The next morning started like any other. Eggs frying in the pan, coffee bubbling on the stove, the soft shuffle of slippers on tile. Lucille hummed low under her breath as she moved around the kitchen, the same song she always hummed when she wanted to forget what day it was. A church hymn, maybe, or something from her childhood. Joe never asked. He sat at the table with the paper folded open in front of him. His fingers drummed once, twice, then stopped. The article wasn't about him, not directly, but it was close. Civil Rights League leader defends accused racketeers, it read. A few more inches and it would have had his face beside the headline again. He read it twice, not because he didn't understand it, but because he knew it was a message. Someone in the media, someone with a badge in their pocket, was trying to blur the lines, tie the League back to the mob, back to him, not with facts, but with tone, suggestion, placement. That's how they did it. Not with a bullet, but a word. And words stuck longer. By noon, Colombo was in Queens, a sit-down with 3 capos from different boroughs, one from Flatbush, one from Staten Island, and one from a crew that didn't even officially exist. That's how nervous things had gotten. Guys who usually avoided each other were now making backroom alliances, cutting side deals, sniffing out survival plans. The sit-down took place in the back of a butcher shop. smelled like raw meat, bleach, and fear. Sal, the Staten Island capo, was already on edge. "This press shit is getting dangerous, Joe," he said without greeting. "You got agents on my nephew's ass now. The kid's 16. He sells weed behind a pizza place, for Christ's sake. That's all." Joe didn't blink. "He's not getting heat because of me." "Oh no?" Sal said, voice rising. "Then what's with the Fed cars outside my sister's house all week? You think they woke up and picked her out of a phone book?" Another capo, Benny from Flatbush, leaned forward. "They think you're building something political. You got guys on the street talking like we're some kind of movement now. We ain't a movement, Joe. We're a business." Joe's jaw tightened. "You know what this league does? It keeps the community tight. It makes us look like people, not shadows. That helps all of us." Benny chuckled. "You think the government gives a shit if we look like people?" "Joe, they're not scared of your rallies. They're scared you forgot what side you're on." After the meeting, Joe didn't go straight home. He drove around the city for hours, no destination, no plan. Just the hum of the engine and the sound of his own breathing. He passed by the old block where he grew up. The tenement was still there. Same cracked steps, same rusty fire escape clinging to the side like a skeleton hand. That was where his father died, shot in the stairwell for a debt someone else owed. Joe was 9. He remembered the blood more than the man, dark and sticky like oil. He remembered the way his mother didn't scream, just dropped to her knees and started praying in Italian like it would put the soul back in his father's chest. He also remembered what she told him that night. "They don't care if you're good, Joseph. Only if you're useful." And now, standing in front of that same building decades later, Joe couldn't help but wonder if she'd been right about everything. By the end of the week, 2 things happened. 1, the FBI froze one of the league's bank accounts, claiming it was funded with laundered money from a stolen goods ring. 2, a man named Sonny Rizzuto got picked up in Little Italy for carrying an unlicensed gun and dropped Colombo's name during questioning. That second one mattered more. Sonny wasn't a big player, just a runner, mid-level, but he was nervous, and nervous men made deals. Joe knew the type. Loose lips, short tempers, and zero loyalty when the cuffs came out. At the Sunday dinner table, his sons were quiet. The usual jokes were gone. The wine wasn't poured. Joe picked at his food, Lucille's lasagna untouched. Finally, Anthony, his oldest, said it. "You're making enemies, Pop." Joe looked at him. "I've always had enemies." "Yeah," Anthony replied, "but now they're the ones who don't miss." That night, Colombo walked into his study and locked the door. The room was quiet, too quiet. No ticking clock, no humming pipes, just silence pressing in on all sides. He opened the drawer in his desk and took out a file. Nothing official, just a manila folder with names, times, and a few photographs. Sonny Rizzuto's face stared back at him, soft jaw, darting eyes, mouth always half open like he was ready to explain something nobody asked. Joe stared at it a long time. Then he picked up the phone. He didn't make threats, he didn't shout, he gave a name, a time, a location, and then hung up. When power starts slipping, you don't ask for loyalty. You demand silence, but silence doesn't last in this world. 2 days later, Sonny was found in a warehouse near the docks, 2 in the chest, 1 in the mouth. The message was clear, no more talking, but it backfired. The media ran with it. "Civil Rights League tied to execution-style murder," the headline screamed. And now, for the first time, people outside the mob started questioning Joe's motives. Journalists who once treated him like a novelty now treated him like a snake. Community leaders who once stood beside him suddenly backed away. Even the churches grew cold. Colombo stood on the stage at the next league rally, but the crowd was thinner. The cheers were quieter, the questions louder. "Is it true you had a man killed? What do you say to the families of his victims? Are you still the right man to lead this league?" Joe didn't answer. He stared out into the sea of eyes, some admiring, some judging, some afraid. And for the first time, he felt alone on stage. Not alone like a performer, alone like a man waiting for a bullet. Back home, Lucille met him at the door. She didn't kiss him, didn't smile. She just handed him a letter, typed. No return address. It said, "Step down, or they'll bury you in that suit." Joe crumpled it without reading the rest, but Lucille saw his hands tremble. That was the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. He tried to sleep that night. He really did. But the dreams came again, not about his father, not about the family, about Anthony, his son. He saw him walking down a street, calm, smiling, then sirens, a black car, screeching tires, gunfire. Anthony went down. The dream ended before Joe reached him. Every time. In the morning, he sat in the kitchen alone. Lucille watched him from the hallway. She didn't come in. She knew that look, that heavy stare into nothing. It was the look of a man doing math in his head. Not money, not power, but cost. What would it cost to hold the line? What would it cost to step down? And what would it cost if he did nothing at all? The next day, a meeting was called. Not by Colombo, by the commission. An emergency gathering of the 5 families. No press, no suits, just shadows in the back room of a closed-down casino in Jersey. They didn't argue, didn't shout. They let Colombo speak first. He did. Calm, measured. "I built this league to protect our people, that's all." Carlo Gambino didn't blink. "You built it to protect yourself." Joe stared at him. "You've known me 20 years. And in those 20 years, Carlo replied, I've never seen a boss beg for cameras." Another boss chimed in, "You're a good earner, Joe. You always have been. But this isn't business. This is ego. This is exposure. And exposure kills." Joe didn't defend himself. He just looked around the room at men who'd once toasted with him, broken bread with him, called him brother. And now? They looked at him like a problem that needed solving. When he got back to Brooklyn, he didn't go inside. He sat in the car outside his house until the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Kids played stickball 2 blocks down. The ice cream truck jingled in the distance, normal sounds. But nothing about his life felt normal anymore. He lit a cigarette. His hand didn't shake this time, but inside, something was unraveling. Not fear, not yet. Something slower. Doubt. And doubt, he knew, was the first real crack before the break. By early spring of 1970, the city had started to change. Not because of Joe Colombo. New York was already bleeding from its own bones. Rent riots in Harlem, teachers striking in Queens, cops walking off the job in Staten Island. Everyone was angry about something. And while the city roared, the men in the shadows, the ones who pulled strings with whispers and nods, were growing more restless. Joe's rallies were still happening, but they weren't the same. The cheers were now polite claps. The crowds looked over their shoulders more often. People didn't want to be photographed near him. Didn't want to get too close to a man with a name that now sat between civil rights and criminal enterprise like a razor blade balanced on edge. The League had become a mirror, showing everyone who they really were, and some didn't like what they saw. Inside the Colombo family, the silence was heavier. Joe noticed it first in the small things. His driver, a man he'd trusted for 7 years, started texting more when he was parked outside, started leaving the car idling even when Joe was going to be inside for an hour. That wasn't normal. Then there was Paulie Nardone, one of his most loyal captains. A guy who used to stop by the house on Sundays just to bring Lucille pastries. Joe hadn't seen him in 3 weeks. When he finally called, Paulie made excuses, said he was laying low, said the FBI was sniffing around. Joe didn't press him, but in his gut he felt it, that old stench of betrayal. At home, the tension had moved inside the walls. Lucille stopped asking questions. That was her defense, always had been. But now it felt like she wasn't just avoiding truth. She was preparing for something she didn't want to say out loud. She moved through the house quieter, talked to the kids in private. Hid cash under floorboards again, a habit she hadn't done in years. One night, Joe caught her packing a small bag in the back closet. "What's that?" he asked. Lucille didn't turn around. "Just clothes for the boys, in case we need to get out fast." Joe stood in the doorway for a long time. Finally, he said, "You think I can't protect you?" Lucille looked at him then, really looked. "I think you're trying to protect two lives at once, Joe, and sooner or later, one's going to eat the other." He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. 2 days later, a man named Frankie Vernazza was arrested in the Bronx with a trunk full of illegal firearms. He was Colombo's guy, directly under Paulie. But the press didn't mention Paulie. They only mentioned the League. Colombo organization tied to weapons cache. That was the headline. Another nail. Not a coffin yet, but the wood was starting to splinter. Joe sat in his study with the lights off, smoking in silence. The walls were thick in that room. Old stone, soundproof. But the noise still found a way in. The ticking of the house, the whisper of wind outside the window, the soft crack of Lucille's heels as she moved through the upstairs hallway. Everything felt louder than it should. He had a meeting the next day. Not business, not mafia, not League. Family. He brought Anthony, his oldest son, to the League office. It was a 3-story building tucked between 2 hardware stores in lower Manhattan. Nothing flashy, just clean, safe. Anthony walked the halls like he didn't belong, even though his name was printed on the documents that made him part owner. That was the arrangement. If something happened to Joe, Anthony would step in. But that day, Joe saw the look in his son's eyes, the hesitation, the fear, the guilt, and knew it would never happen. "You don't want this life," Joe said, closing the door behind them. Anthony shrugged. "It's already mine." "No," Joe said. "Wearing a name ain't the same as carrying it." Anthony sat across from him, fidgeted with a pen. "You still believe in this League?" he asked, not looking up. Joe leaned back in his chair. "I don't know." Anthony finally looked at him. "Then why keep going?" Joe took a long drag off his cigarette. "Because it's the only thing I've built that didn't start with a body." That same week, word came down from a back channel. Gambino was making moves, not direct, not violent, but strategic. Old allies were switching sides. Businesses once under Colombo control were getting new offers from Gambino men. Protection at half the price, no press, no headlines. Joe met with Louis D'Angelo, a mid-level guy who worked the garment district. Honest earner, trusted. "You gonna jump ship?" Joe asked, flat. Louis looked uncomfortable. "Come on, boss, you know I'm with you." "I know a lot of things, Louis," Joe said, "but I don't hear your name getting mentioned anymore. That makes me nervous." Louis swallowed hard. "Look, it ain't personal. It's just business is softer with all this heat. Guys are scared." Joe stood, walked around the desk, put a hand on Louis's shoulder. "Tell me something, Louis. You ever see me run from heat?" "No, boss." "You ever see me let this family starve?" "No." "Then don't start acting like I'm already dead." Louis nodded, eyes glassy. But Joe knew that nod. It was the same nod rats gave before they disappeared. Back home, Anthony was packing again. This time, not just for the kids. Joe stood in the doorway as his son zipped up a suitcase. "You leaving?" Anthony nodded. "Where to?" "Upstate, near Albany. Friend's place." Joe didn't argue. He didn't ask him to stay. He just stood there, watching the boy he'd raised now moving like a man he no longer recognized. "You think I ruined this family?" Joe asked. Anthony zipped the bag closed and turned. "No," he said, "but I think you couldn't save it either." That night, Colombo had dinner alone. Lucille didn't come to the table. The boys were gone. The house felt like a tomb, cold, filled with the ghosts of conversations that never got to finish. He ate slowly, chewing until the flavor vanished. Then he opened a small bottle of scotch and sat at the table, drinking in silence, watching the window. Across the street, a black sedan pulled up, parked, stayed. Didn't move for hours. He didn't know if it was the feds or something worse. He didn't care anymore. In the morning, his consigliere, Ralph Esposito, came to visit. Old man, loyal, quiet, not a coward, but cautious. The kind of man who survived decades in the life because he never let emotions speak before his mouth. "You're losing them," Ralph said bluntly, sitting across from Joe in the den. "I know." Gambino's pulling strings. Your captains are nervous. They think you're too public, too loud. Joe rubbed his eyes. They're not wrong. Ralph leaned in. You got 3 options, Joe. Step down, fight back, or die. Joe stared at him. Ralph didn't flinch. I don't say that to scare you, he added. I say that because I know how this story ends. I've seen it before. Joe looked out the window, sunlight cutting sharp through the curtains. Funny, he said. They said the same thing about my father. By the end of that week, 3 more businesses jumped ship. One of Joe's guys in Jersey disappeared, later found in a river, hands tied, mouth stuffed with paper, league flyers, a message. The old world was done playing nice. Joe stood on the stage at the next rally, looking over the shrinking crowd. The cheers were thin, faces anxious. He gave the same speech about unity, about respect, about the American dream. But this time, his voice didn't carry. Even he could hear it. There was no more dream, just debt. Backstage, after the rally, he sat alone with a warm glass of water and a newspaper. Another article about his criminal ties. Another rumor about the league being dismantled. Another knife in the back, dressed up as journalism. He didn't get angry, didn't flip the table, didn't curse. He just sat there, breathing slowly, staring at the floor. And for the first time in a long time, Joe Colombo felt tired. Not physically, not emotionally, existentially, as if the weight of everything, the blood, the money, the love, the betrayal, had finally cracked something inside him that would never heal. He went home that night, climbed into bed next to Lucille. She was already half asleep. He stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open. What if I gave it all up? He asked. Lucille didn't move. Would it matter? He whispered. Still no answer. Eventually she reached for his hand, held it tight, then let go, and turned away. The sun was just beginning to rise when Frank Lupo made the call. He was in the back room of a rundown cafe in the Bronx, one eye on the window, one hand on the pistol in his waistband. His voice was low, panicked, but he kept it from cracking. He's gonna flip, Frank said. I'm telling you, Paulie's talking to someone. Might be the feds, might be worse. The man on the other end didn't say anything for a long moment, then finally, coldly, handle it. Quiet. Frank hung up. His palms were sweating. He didn't want to do this. But he also didn't want to end up in a ditch with his mouth sewn shut. Paulie Nardone had been many things. Stubborn, sarcastic, loyal in his own twisted way. But no one ever accused him of being careless. At least, not until lately. He hadn't shown up to the last 3 crew meetings. Hadn't returned calls from the old social club. And then, word got out. Someone had seen him talking to a federal agent in a diner in Brooklyn, not once, but twice. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just Paulie being Paulie. But in this life, maybe was what got people killed. Frank followed him 2 nights in a row. Watched him leave the same corner store at the same time. Same route, same steps, predictable. That's what made him vulnerable. Joe Colombo didn't know any of this yet. He was at his Midtown office staring at a list of friendly donors for the league. Most of them weren't so friendly anymore. The names were drying up. The checks smaller. One man who used to write 10 grand like it was lunch money had just sent a telegram instead. Wish you well, but I can't be involved anymore. Too much heat. ML. Joe read it 3 times. He could have called him. Could have sent someone to knock on the man's door. But what was the point? Loyalty only lasted as long as it was convenient. He'd learned that from both sides of his life. At noon, Ralph Esposito came by again. He sat down without a word, his face pale. Not tired, not sick, worried. He slid a manila envelope across Joe's desk. Joe didn't open it. Another rat? Ralph nodded. Maybe. Maybe not. What's in the maybe pile? Paulie Nardone. Joe blinked, slowly. Oh, Paulie? He's not answering. He's not showing up. Somebody spotted him with a Fed named Clancy. Guys known for flipping low-level wise guys. Joe's jaw flexed. Ralph continued. We don't know what was said. Could have been nothing. Could have been something. Joe picked up the envelope, tapped it against the desk, then said, we find out before or after someone puts him in the ground. Ralph didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. It might already be too late. Frank Lupo waited outside Paulie's apartment until the lights went out. He sat in his car, engine off, a pack of Camels on the passenger seat, and a baseball bat resting under his leg. He didn't want to shoot Paulie. That would have been too loud, too permanent, too public. But a warning, a message, that could work. Let him know he was being watched. Let him understand what silence meant. He waited until the street was quiet, slipped out of the car, and crept into the building. The front door lock was broken. Typical. 5th floor, apartment 5C. He moved quiet, like he had a dozen times before when the job wasn't this personal. He reached the door, raised the bat, knocked once, not hard. Paulie opened the door, half asleep, shirtless, blinking. "Frank," he said. That was the last thing he got out before the bat cracked into his ribs. The next morning, Joe got the call. Paulie was in the hospital, 2 busted ribs, a broken wrist, fractured jaw. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't quiet either. He'd told the nurses it was a mugging, told the cops he fell down the stairs, told the feds nothing. So far. But Joe knew that window wouldn't stay closed forever. He met Ralph in a quiet corner of the league office. "That wasn't a warning," Ralph said. "That was desperation, and desperation gets messy." Joe nodded. He was family. Ralph gave him a look. No. He was business. Joe didn't answer, but something about that line stuck in his throat. Later that night, Colombo sat in the garden behind his house. The city buzzed in the distance, but out here it was still, just cicadas and the faint smell of soil and pipe smoke. Lucille came out with a coat draped over her arm. "You'll catch cold." "I'm fine," he said. She sat beside him anyway. "You think they'll kill him?" she asked softly. Joe didn't respond. She wasn't asking out of fear, not for Paulie anyway. She was asking because she knew this was the moment Joe either chose his name or chose his cause. "You can't be both, Joseph," she whispered. "Not anymore. I'm not giving up the league. That's not what I mean." She turned to face him. "I mean the man who started that league, the one who said no more hiding, no more blood. He doesn't exist if Paulie dies." Joe closed his eyes. "I didn't order the beating. But you didn't stop it either." The next day, the newspapers got wind of Paulie's attack. They didn't use his real name, just referred to him as a known associate of Joseph Colombo. That was enough. Another headline, another blow. And this time, the league started bleeding from the inside. Volunteers quit. A public supporter gave an interview to the Post claiming he was misled about Colombo's past. Joe walked into his office and found a dozen envelopes stacked on his desk, each one a resignation, some handwritten, some typed. One just said, "You brought light to our name, but now it's burning us." He stared at the pile for a long time, then threw it in the trash without opening another one. The pressure from the 5 families didn't slow down either. Gambino's crew had moved into Midtown. Lucchese guys were squeezing Colombo's old allies in Queens. Joe's name was now a burden, not a banner. And worst of all, some of his own men were watching him with new eyes, the kind that looked not for guidance, but weakness. That night, Joe called a private meeting at a safe house in Brooklyn. Just Ralph and 3 captains, tension thick enough to choke on. "We can't afford to play nice anymore," Joe said, lighting a cigarette. "What's the play?" asked Benny, the Flatbush capo. Joe leaned forward. "No more whispers, no more rallies. We shut the league down." The room went dead silent. Even Ralph blinked. "You serious?" he asked. Joe nodded. "It served its purpose." "And what was that exactly?" Benny asked. Joe didn't answer, because even he didn't know anymore. But later that night, sitting alone in the same garden, Colombo reached into his coat and pulled out the original mission statement he'd written for the league. Just a page, folded, yellowed, handwritten in thick pen. To give Italian Americans a voice, to protect the name, to defend the dignity of our families, our sons, our fathers. We are not criminals. We are not shadows. We are Americans. Joe stared at it, not as a leader, not as a boss, but as a man. And for the first time, the words felt like a lie. The League office smelled different now, not like it used to, a mix of cheap cologne, ink, coffee, and Italian bread from the deli 2 doors down. Now it smelled like dust and sweat, like an empty house after a storm. Joe sat alone at the conference table, the blinds half open behind him, letting in just enough light to throw his shadow onto the far wall. He didn't move much anymore when he was here. No jokes, no speeches, just silence. The kind that crawled across your skin like cold wind. A radio played faintly in the background. News, static. A story about the city budget, the rising crime in Queens. Nothing about the League today. That was unusual. They always had something to say, but for the past week, the press had gone quiet. And Joe knew what that meant. They were waiting for something to break, something final. That morning, Ralph Esposito had come in with tired eyes and a deeper limp than usual. "Word is Carlo wants a vote," Ralph said without sitting. Joe didn't turn. "A vote?" "For removal." Joe leaned back slowly. "They want me out." "They don't just want you out," Ralph replied. "They want you erased, like you were never at that table." Joe picked up a pen from the desk, turned it slowly in his fingers. "You think they'll go through with it?" Ralph didn't blink. "They're already through with it, Joe. The only question now is who pulls the trigger." Later that day, 2 FBI agents showed up outside Joe's house in Bensonhurst, not to arrest him, just to watch. They stood in plain clothes across the street, leaning against a black sedan, drinking coffee and pretending they weren't building a case. Joe watched them from the front window, sipping espresso, calm. He didn't call his lawyer, didn't call anyone. Instead, he opened the window, looked out, and raised his cup slightly in mock salute. They didn't flinch. He smiled. Just a little. If they were this bold now, it meant someone inside had started talking again. Maybe Polly. Maybe someone else. Didn't matter. The walls were closing in and everyone could smell it. Inside the League office that evening, Joe gathered the last of the paperwork. They were shutting it down, just like he'd said. Ralph had already made the calls, told the press there'd be no more rallies for the time being, blamed it on pressure from City Hall. It was a lie, but one with a clean face. Joe stood in the back hallway, staring at the portraits hung on the wall, photos from the early rallies, big crowds, raised fists, smiling men in suits. It had all looked so clean back then, so possible. Now? Now the only sound was the flickering of the overhead light and the faint creak of floorboards under his own shoes. He stared at a photo of himself from 2 years ago, mid-speech, hand raised, eyes alive. He touched the glass lightly. "I should have known," he whispered, then walked away. That night, Frank Lupo came to see him. Joe wasn't surprised. Frank was the kind of soldier who knew when to appear and when to vanish. He looked uncomfortable, sweaty, pacing. "They're saying you're slipping, Joe." Joe poured him a drink. "You think I am?" Frank shrugged. "I think you're not the same guy who used to throw hands at the dock over a $20 mishap." Joe chuckled softly. "That guy died a long time ago." Frank drank, then said it. "They voted already. Carlo, Lucchese, even Tommy from Bay Ridge. They want someone else in the seat." "Who?" Frank hesitated. Then, "Benny." Joe stared at him. The words took a second to land. Benny, the Flatbush capo, the one Joe made, raised up, protected. "Figures," Joe said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded hollow. Back home, Lucille was reading in bed when Joe walked in. She didn't look up. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. She had her glasses on, hair wrapped in a scarf, a worn Bible in her lap, even though she hadn't turned a page in 5 minutes. "You okay?" she asked, still not meeting his eyes. Joe nodded, even though he wasn't sure. "I'm thinking of going public again." Lucille's hand tightened around the page. "Why?" Joe sat on the edge of the bed. Because if I go down, I want it to be on my feet, not in the dark. She closed the Bible, turned to face him. And if they shoot you in front of everyone? Joe shrugged. Then they have to own it. Lucille stared at him. You're tired, Joseph, but tired men don't make peace. They make messes. He kissed her hand, didn't speak, and she didn't push him, because deep down, she already knew what he'd decided. The next day, Joe made a phone call to a reporter, someone he trusted, someone who'd written about the League with a little more nuance than most. He invited him to the rally scheduled 2 weeks out, one they weren't supposed to have. It's a mistake, Ralph warned. They already think I'm finished, Joe replied. Might as well go out making noise. Ralph rubbed his face. They'll be watching. I know. They might shoot you. Joe smiled faintly. I know that too. In the streets, whispers started again. Colombo's planning something. He's going public. He's daring them. Even among his own people, the air shifted. Loyalty and fear were now identical twins. Frank Lupo showed up again, said nothing this time, just stood by the wall while Joe signed off on papers, made calls, arranged final donations to keep the illusion alive. I'm staying, Frank said finally. Joe looked up. You don't have to. I know, Frank said, but I'm staying anyway. Joe nodded. That was the closest thing to love a man like him was ever going to get. The day of the rally arrived fast, June 28, 1971. Bright, cloudless sky. It was supposed to be quiet, a quick gathering in Columbus Circle, just speeches, flags, a press op. But nothing in Joe's life had ever ended quietly. The streets were packed, not like the old rallies, not roaring, but tight, watchful, uneasy. There were more cameras now, more police, more eyes. Joe stepped out of the black sedan wearing a navy suit and dark sunglasses. His sons were nearby. Frank, Ralph, a few loyal faces, but most had faded. He walked up to the podium, one hand raised to wave, the other clutching his speech. And then, as he reached the mic, the first shot rang out. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams tore through the crowd. A second shot followed, then a third. Joe staggered. Blood bloomed on his shoulder, then again in his lower back. His legs gave out. He crumpled at the base of the stage. People ran in every direction. Photographers dropped their cameras. Police ducked. His sons shouted his name, but it was drowned in sirens. More shots. Not all of them at Joe. Someone else was hit, maybe a bodyguard. Frank fired back. Someone else tackled the shooter. Then, more cops joined in. It lasted under 20 seconds, but it was enough. Joe lay bleeding on the pavement, staring up at the sky, blinking slowly. The world went white. Then gray. Then soft. He didn't die that day. But something in him did. They said it was a miracle he survived. That's what the doctors told Lucille. That's what the nurses said in quiet voices behind masks and gloves. But miracle wasn't the word that stuck with her. Trap was. Joe had been standing at a microphone, in public, surrounded by cameras, cops, his sons, his men. No one expected it to happen there. No one expected a black man in a fake press badge to walk up, pull a gun, and put 3 bullets into Joseph Colombo in front of the whole goddamn city. One in the shoulder, one in the back, one through the neck. That third one shattered his spine. They rushed him to Roosevelt Hospital in Midtown. His pulse was weak. He wasn't breathing on his own. Machines took over almost immediately. Lucille wasn't allowed to see him at first. Too much press outside. Too many cops asking questions. Too many doctors unsure if he'd make it through the night. But he did. He survived the first night, and then the second, and the third, until survival turned into something worse than death. Joe Colombo was alive, but he was no longer present. He lay in a private room surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the soft beep of heart monitors. His eyes were open sometimes, but they didn't focus. His hands didn't move. His mouth never twitched. The city was outside the window, alive, loud, moving. But Joseph Colombo was locked inside his own body. The League fell apart in days. Without Joe's voice, his presence, his hands on the wheel, the men who claimed loyalty quickly started tearing it apart for scraps. The office closed temporarily. The donation lines dried up. Even some of the banners were torn down by city workers, muttering about permits and codes that had never mattered before. Without Joe, the League was just another empty cause, and nobody wanted to be seen holding it when the music stopped. His sons tried to hold on, Anthony especially. He stayed at the hospital every day, sat beside his father, read to him, talked to him like he was still in the room. The doctors said it helped, that Joe might still hear them, that parts of the brain still registered sound. But Anthony could tell. His father wasn't in there anymore. Just breath, just heartbeat, just waiting. Back in Brooklyn, Ralph Esposito moved carefully. He hadn't vanished like some of the others. He didn't run, but he didn't stay loud either. He visited Lucille once, brought her pastries, sat in the kitchen like it was any other Sunday. They didn't talk about the League. They didn't talk about the shooter. They just drank coffee, and Ralph told a story about Joe getting into a fist fight over a rigged poker game in '59. Lucille smiled once, but her eyes were empty. The FBI was everywhere. They used the shooting as an excuse to kick in doors that had been closed for years. Joe's name was now a symbol of chaos, a broken empire with no king. They arrested low-level earners, pressured capos, offered deals to men who used to laugh at the idea of flipping. And they started building a new narrative. The League was a front. Colombo was a fraud. The civil rights cause was camouflage for criminal infrastructure. The headlines came fast. Mob boss shot at peace rally. Italian civil rights leader or criminal kingpin. Colombo's empire in free fall. The media had no mercy. And why should they? The man they feared was now a name on a hospital bed. Easy to attack, easier to forget. In the world of the five families, the seat was already cold. Carlo Gambino didn't speak publicly, but everyone knew his hands were all over the aftermath. He pushed for Bonifacio to take Colombo's place, not as a boss, but as a caretaker, a puppet. Most agreed. They didn't care about loyalty. They cared about structure. A broken family meant cops. Cops meant heat. Heat meant money lost. And in that world, nothing mattered more than money. Frank Lupo tried to hold the streets. He met with the crews, made collections, tried to keep Joe's name alive. But guys laughed behind his back. They called him the Candle, as if he was the last flicker of light before darkness came. Some refused to pay. Others flipped to the Gambino crew. And one, a young hothead from Flatlands, threw a punch at Frank during a sit-down. Frank broke 3 of his ribs in return. But it didn't change anything. The old days were gone. The name Colombo now meant liability. Lucille never left the hospital for long. She sat beside Joe most afternoons, talked to him about things he wouldn't remember even if he woke up, about the garden, about the neighbors, about Anthony's new job and the way his younger brother had started seeing a girl from Bay Ridge. Sometimes she read the Bible aloud. Sometimes she just sat in silence, listening to the slow beep of the machine. And sometimes, when no one else was in the room, she'd lean close and whisper, "I told you this life would kill you, Joseph. I just didn't know it would do it so slowly." The shooter, Jerome Johnson, was gunned down on the scene, dead before anyone could ask him why. The official story was that he acted alone, that he was mentally unstable, that he had no clear motive. But in back rooms and quiet corners of the city, a different story moved like smoke through cracks in the walls. Gambino paid for the hit. Lucchese sanctioned it. They used a black shooter to make it look political, to confuse the story, poison the League's name, divide the public. No one could prove any of it, but that was the point. In this world, truth didn't matter. Only belief did. 3 weeks after the shooting, Anthony finally broke. He stood over his father's bed, fists clenched, eyes burning. "You said they'd respect you," he whispered. "You said they'd see us different." Joe didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't breathe any different than he had for the last 20 days. Anthony slammed his hand down on the tray beside the bed. "He's not in there," he shouted, voice cracking. Lucille pulled him back, tears in her eyes. But she didn't disagree. Outside the hospital, Frank met Ralph for coffee. They sat on a bench like two retired men. except both carried pistols in their coats and watched every passerby like they were being hunted. "It's over," Ralph said finally. Frank didn't reply. "You know it. I know it. Joe's gone. The league's dead. The streets are carving up what's left." Frank sipped his coffee. "We made something," Ralph nodded. "Yeah, we made noise, and noise don't last." They sat a while longer in silence. Then Ralph stood. "If you're smart," he said, "you'll disappear." Frank looked up at him. "I ain't built for disappearing." Ralph shook his head. Neither was Joe, and in that hospital bed, Colombo kept breathing, not because of strength, not because of will, but because machines had replaced both. He was a name now, a story, a legend, a warning. Some days, reporters still came by, hoping for an update. There was never one. Other days, old friends sent flowers. Lucille threw most of them out. The ones that came with no card, she burned, because she knew exactly what they meant. "Rest now, Joe. You're not a threat anymore." But inside that silent room, where the air was thick with bleach and cold metal and old prayers, Joseph Colombo still existed. And though no one could see it, his eyes sometimes moved. The hospital room had become a shrine. White walls, quiet beeping, sunlight that never seemed to warm anything. Every day Lucille came. Same time, same seat, same look on her face. Not grief, not hope, just that strange limbo between them. Her hands were worn now, more than ever before. She held rosary beads even when she wasn't praying. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and just listen to his breathing, the way a mother listens for her baby's heartbeat. The nurses had come to know her well. They stopped asking if she needed anything. They knew better. She only needed him, awake. But Joseph Colombo had been staring at the same ceiling for 43 days now. And though his eyes sometimes fluttered, though his fingers twitched now and then like old film static, the doctors still called it what it was, persistent vegetative state. Lucille called it waiting. Outside the hospital, the world was moving without him, and fast. Benny Fazio now ran the streets in Colombo's name, but only on paper. Everyone knew he wasn't built for leadership. He didn't inspire fear or loyalty. He inspired deals, the kind that lined pockets but couldn't hold borders. And the other families? They were already carving the Colombo territory up like Thanksgiving meat. The Gambinos had taken over the numbers in Bay Ridge. Lucchese boys ran hijacking out of Howard Beach now. Even the Bananos, usually quiet, had slid into Bensonhurst like rats down a back alley, cutting into old rackets with zero resistance. The men who once fought to carry Joe's favor now fought to erase his memory. And the League? It was officially gone. The signs were pulled off the door, the phones disconnected, the mailing list sold to a political group in Jersey. Only one man still tried to keep Joe's name alive. Anthony. Anthony Colombo wasn't like his father. He was clean-cut, calm, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. But something in him had started to twist. The first time he visited the old League office, now just an empty building with paint peeling off the front windows, he walked through the halls like a ghost retracing his own death. He found an old box under a pile of chairs. Inside were old photos, news clippings, Joe's handwritten notes for speeches. One was titled, "The American Lie." He took the folder home, sat with it all night, and by morning he decided they weren't going to forget his father, not like this. But Frank Lupo had a different view. He'd been running the streets for too long. He knew how things worked when a boss fell, whether he died, disappeared, or slipped into silence. The power didn't mourn, it moved, and fast. Still, he tried to hold on to pieces of what Joe built, kept the neighborhood guys working, gave kickbacks to old allies, visited the old bookies just to remind them that someone still gave a damn. But it wasn't working. One day, a kid from a Lucchese crew walked into Frank's corner bar and demanded a cut of the take. Frank asked who sent him. The kid laughed. "The city did," he said. "You just didn't hear it yet." Frank didn't shoot him, didn't even threaten him. He just nodded and let the kid leave. Then he sat in the back room for 3 hours, bottle of scotch in front of him, not touching it. The war was already over. He just hadn't buried the flag yet. At the hospital, Anthony leaned close to his father's ear one afternoon. He spoke quietly, like he used to when they'd fix cars in the driveway together, back when things were simpler and the only thing bleeding was oil. "Ma says you can hear us." Joe didn't move. "I don't know if that's true, but I'm going to talk anyway. Because someone has to say this out loud." He paused. "They're gutting your legacy, Pop." Another pause. "Gambino, Benny, the whole damn city, even the people you helped, they act like you never existed. Like you were just noise. And you know what hurts the most?" Anthony's voice cracked. "They might be right." He wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed by his own emotion. "But I'm not gonna let that happen. I swear to God I'll make them remember, even if I have to choke the words into their throats." Back in Brooklyn, Ralph Esposito was moving slower now. Age, stress, guilt, take your pick. He stayed out of the street game. Too risky. But he still took calls, still gave advice, still sat in the back of a church pew every Wednesday morning like it was the only place left in the world that hadn't turned its back on him. One afternoon, Anthony called him. "Can we talk?" They met in the back of a hardware store Ralph used to run under a cousin's name. Dusty shelves, fake inventory, real cameras, the kind of spot no one looked at twice. "You really think you can save his name?" Ralph asked. "I don't need to save it," Anthony replied. "Just remind people what it meant." Ralph smiled, slow and sad. "Your father never wanted to be a symbol, kid. He wanted to be respected. Now he's a picture on a wall that people argue about." Anthony leaned forward. "What if I restarted the league?" Ralph raised an eyebrow. "You looking to die faster?" "I'm serious. You can't revive a movement built on a man who can't even blink." Anthony's jaw tightened. "So we let them spit on his grave while he's still breathing?" Ralph sighed. "You sound like your father." Anthony stood. "Then maybe it's time someone did." But Anthony wasn't just fighting ghosts. He was now on someone's radar. 3 days after that conversation, he came home to find his apartment door ajar. Nothing stolen, but the place had been searched, not carefully. Deliberately. A message. They were watching. He found a bullet on his nightstand. Clean. Polished. He didn't tell Lucille, didn't tell his brothers, but he did stop sleeping. In the Bronx, word started spreading. A Colombo son was stirring up old fires. Anthony was meeting with former League volunteers, talking to reporters off the record, posting clips of his father's old speeches on underground channels, the kind that reached people tired of being quiet, tired of being forgotten. The campaign wasn't loud, not yet, but it was persistent, and persistence in this city was a threat. Frank warned him. "This isn't your fight." Anthony didn't budge. "You think I'm doing this to play tough?" "No," Frank said. "I think you're doing it to find your father and yourself." Anthony stared at him. "I already did." Frank lit a cigarette, coughed once, and looked away. "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" "I don't care what comes next." Frank shook his head. "That's what your father said before he got shot in the spine." Meanwhile, Colombo lay silent, still breathing, still watching, if you believed in things like that. Sometimes, at night, Lucille would hold his hand and swear she felt a twitch, not a spasm, not a reflex, but intent. She didn't tell the doctors. They'd write it off. She didn't tell the nurses. They'd nod and smile like she was another widow in waiting. She told Joe. Every night. "I know you're in there, Joseph, and they're destroying everything you built. You need to wake up, or your name dies." She didn't cry anymore when she said it. She was long past tears. But Joe didn't wake up. And outside that small white room, men were preparing to bury him, not in the ground, but in reputation, in memory, in silence. Only his son stood in the way. And everyone knew how that kind of story ended. Anthony stood on the steps of the old League office, staring at the locked door like it was a casket. The paint had chipped off the edges. The sign had been scraped off the window, leaving a faint ghost of lettering behind. The Italian-American Civil Rights League. Now it was just a shell, but for Anthony, it was the last place where his father's voice still echoed, where everything had made sense even if only for a moment. He pulled a small set of keys from his jacket. He didn't know if they still worked or if someone had changed the locks. They hadn't. He stepped inside. The lights were dead. The air stale. Old flyers littered the floor, messages of pride, unity, and strength, now half-faded and curling at the corners. He stood in the silence for a long time. Then he turned on his phone's flashlight and walked to the back office. It was still there, his father's desk. The same one Joe had signed hundreds of documents at. The same one he stood behind for press interviews. The one he sat at the night before his last rally, fingers pressed together, thinking about things Anthony would never understand. Anthony sat down in the chair, placed his hands exactly where Joe had, and whispered to no one, "I'm not him, but I'm all that's left." The next day, he made the call. A press contact. Someone who still remembered the league before it became a scandal. They met in a diner in Sheepshead Bay. Quiet booth in the back. No cameras, no mics. The reporter was cautious. "You really want to talk on the record?" she asked. "After everything that happened?" Anthony stirred his coffee. "My father built something. You don't have to believe in it, but I do, and I'm not letting his name rot in that hospital bed." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "You're trying to restart the league?" "I'm trying to finish what he started." She didn't smile, didn't scoff. She just said, "You're going to make a lot of people nervous." Anthony leaned in. "Good." Within a week, the first article hit. "Son of Joseph Colombo speaks. The league will return." The headline ran in a smaller paper, not the Times, not the Post, but it spread. The phones started ringing. Old supporters reached out, cautious, quiet, but curious. Some offered money, some offered meeting space, some just said, "Thank you." But not all the calls were friendly. 3 nights later, Anthony's car alarm went off outside his apartment. Nothing was stolen, but there was a dead pigeon on the hood, throat slit, feathers soaked in blood. A note taped to the windshield. "Birds that sing too loud don't fly far." He read it in silence. Didn't tell Lucille. Didn't tell the cops. Just crumpled the paper, threw it in the trash, and went back inside. His jaw was set, his hands steady, but the chill crept into his bones anyway. Meanwhile, Frank Lupo was hearing whispers. They came from street kids, small-time enforcers, guys who used to walk with their heads high under Joe's flag. Now they ducked into side alleys and back bars to speak the truth. Anthony's stirring ghosts. He's going to get himself killed. The name Colombo doesn't scare anyone anymore. It just invites bullets. Frank met with Ralph Esposito again, this time in the basement of a church in Gravesend. The 2 old men sat in pews beneath flickering fluorescent lights. "He's got his father's heart," Ralph said. Frank lit a cigarette with shaky hands. "And none of his armor." Ralph didn't disagree. "But maybe that's what makes him dangerous." Frank looked at him sideways. "Dangerous to who?" Ralph didn't answer, because the real question wasn't who Anthony might hurt. It was who'd kill him first. At the hospital, Joe remained still, his body thinner now, skin pale, machines doing all the work. Lucille sat beside him every day, but something had changed in her. She didn't pray anymore, didn't whisper encouragements. She just sat, silent, watching. One afternoon, she looked at his face and said, almost like a confession, "I miss the man who scared me." She didn't cry after she said it. She just folded her hands in her lap and stared at the monitor like it might blink back. Then came the threat. Not subtle. A phone call, blocked number. Anthony answered out of instinct. The voice was deep, calm, and didn't introduce itself. "You keep going like this, and someone's going to bleed. Might be you. Might be someone you care about." Anthony's voice didn't waver. "You done?" The voice chuckled. "You don't even know what game you're playing, kid." "I'm not playing," Anthony said. "I'm building." The voice paused. "Then build yourself a coffin while you're at it." Click. The line went dead. That night, Anthony drove out to Coney Island, parked by the water, got out, lit a cigarette he didn't smoke, The wind whipped cold and hard off the waves, smacking his coat open like a warning. He looked up at the stars, spoke like his father might be listening from behind a locked door in the sky. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," he said. He clenched his fists. "But I know I'm doing it better than nothing." The next morning, a bomb went off. Not literal. Media. A leaked FBI document appeared in several outlets, dated months before Joe's shooting, alleging that Colombo had used league donations to pay legal fees for known mobsters. The article claimed the league was always a strategic front for laundering influence into legitimacy. The internet, what little of it cared, erupted. "See? We told you. Just another criminal in a suit. His son's trying to clean blood with press releases." Anthony's phone didn't stop buzzing. Some old allies backed out of meetings. Others pulled donations. Even Lucille stopped answering his calls. He sat in the dark of his apartment that night, phone in his lap, hands shaking, not with fear, but rage. Everything he tried to build was rotting before it could stand. Then came the visit. Frank showed up at his door just after midnight. No call, no warning, just a knock. Anthony opened the door and stepped back. Frank didn't waste time. "You need to stop." Anthony narrowed his eyes. "You came all the way here to fold?" Frank stepped inside. "I came here to stop you from getting your head blown off. I'm not quitting. You think this is noble? You think this is your father's voice speaking through you? It's not. It's your own pride, and pride gets buried fast around here." Anthony's voice stayed low but firm. "My father didn't die for nothing." Frank exhaled through his nose. "He didn't die. That's the problem." Anthony blinked. Frank stepped closer. "Your father's alive, and every breath he takes is a reminder to the families that they missed. They don't like reminders." Anthony frowned. "You think they'll finish the job?" "I think if you keep making noise, they'll finish it through you." Silence settled between them. Then Anthony said, "Then let them come." Frank looked at him like a man watching a fuse burn down to nothing. "You're not bulletproof, kid. You're just your father's shadow, and the city's learned how to kill shadows." But it was too late. The rally had already been scheduled, 1 block from the hospital, the first league gathering in over a year, and Anthony was headlining it. The day of the rally, the city felt wrong. Too still, too bright, too quiet. A breeze rolled down the street like it was looking for something to knock over. Lucille didn't come, neither did Frank. But hundreds of others did. Old league members, curious kids, a few media cameras, and more than one set of eyes who didn't belong. Too still, too quiet, too clean. Anthony stepped onto the makeshift stage in a dark blue suit, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked out at the crowd and said, "I'm not my father, but I carry his name, and I will not let that name die in silence." The crowd stirred. He continued, "You may call him a mobster, you may call him a liar, but he also stood up for people who were told to shut up and disappear. He gave a voice to those who only ever had whispers. And I'm here to make sure that voice doesn't get buried with him." A pause. Someone clapped. Then a few more. Then the whole crowd. For a moment, Anthony stood there in the light, head high, heart pounding. No bullets, no warnings, just breath, just pride, just memory. But 3 blocks away, in a black sedan, a man was watching through binoculars. No badge, no press pass, just orders. He lowered the binoculars, made a call. "It's him," he said. "Yeah, he's got the room." The voice on the other end replied, "Let's give him one more speech, then end the chapter." The day after the rally, Anthony woke to find his name plastered across 3 different news websites, not at the top, but not buried either. Colombo's son reignites the league. Ghost of a crime family speaks at public gathering. Redemption or legacy grab. The articles were mostly fair, not sympathetic, but not assassins either. They quoted him directly, used his words, gave just enough background to remind readers who Joseph Colombo was. Civil rights leader, suspected mob boss, survivor of a public assassination attempt. One article, though, cut differently. It ran under a simple headline: Anthony Colombo is playing with fire. It quoted unnamed law enforcement sources. It speculated about internal power struggles. It suggested Anthony's actions could undermine decades of stabilization among New York's 5 families. And then, near the bottom, if he keeps pushing forward, he won't end up like his father. He'll end up buried next to him. Anthony read the article twice, didn't flinch, didn't curse, just folded his laptop closed and stared at the ceiling for a full minute. Then, quietly, "You're not dead yet, but they already talk like you are." That morning, he went to see his father. Roosevelt Hospital, room 607. Same white walls, same stale air, the same hum of machines, an orchestra of slow decay. Lucille was there already. She didn't smile when Anthony entered, just nodded. Anthony kissed Joe's forehead, like always, then sat down and leaned close. "You should have seen it," he whispered. They listened, not all of them, but enough. "You still scare people, even now." He glanced at Lucille. She was reading her Bible again. "I think they're going to come for me," he added. "I don't know who. Maybe Benny, maybe someone else, but it's coming." He smiled, bitter and small. "I hope it's quick, just not messy. Ma can't handle another hospital bed." Joe didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe any different than he had for the last year. But Anthony swore, just for a second, the corner of his father's lip twitched. In a warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront, Benny Fazio held court. He wasn't Joe, never had been, never would be. But the room was full. 12 men, all mid-level captains, the kind of men who once kissed Joe's ring. Now they barely spoke his name. Benny stood with a scotch in his hand, sleeves rolled up, tie half loose. "I want it clean," he said. "Fast. No spray, no witnesses." A few of the men shifted. One of them, an older guy named Gino, raised a hand. "You sure about this? He's just the kid. He's not pulling any weight." Benny's smile faded. "That kid's pulling eyes, headlines, cameras. He makes us look like we're asleep." Another man nodded. "If we clip him, though, that makes noise. Heat." Benny drank, wiped his mouth. "Colombo made this family loud. That was his first mistake. We make it quiet again." A younger guy, face too smooth to trust, asked, "You want it to look like the street? Or personal?" Benny shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Just make sure he doesn't see it coming." But someone else was listening. Frank Lupo was in the next room. He'd been invited, supposed to sit in, but he'd taken a phone call, stepped away, and heard enough through the thin warehouse wall. He didn't move, didn't blink, just listened. Then left the building before anyone saw. He didn't say a word, but the rage in his chest burned hotter than it had in years. That night, Frank knocked on Lucille's door. It was after 10. She answered with a tired face, wearing her robe and holding a cup of weak tea. She stared at him like she already knew. "Come in," she said. They sat in the living room. Frank didn't waste time. "They voted on your son." Lucille didn't react. She didn't gasp, didn't cry. She just looked down at her tea. "They're going to kill him?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Who?" "Benny, with Carlo's blessing. Maybe Lucchese, too." Lucille closed her eyes and whispered, "Joseph, wake up." Anthony didn't know. Not yet. He was back at the league office, or what was left of it, trying to get the phones turned back on, trying to find anyone who still gave a damn. He didn't see the man parked across the street in a black sedan, didn't notice the way the guy sat too still, wore sunglasses in the shade, smoked, but never flicked the ash, didn't know his picture had already been passed around. He was marked. Walking, breathing, and marked. Frank met him later that night, called him out to the docks, old stomping grounds, concrete, salt air, the smell of rust and gasoline. Anthony pulled up, headlights cutting across a stack of rotted crates. Frank was already leaning against a post, cigarette glowing. "I hear you're pushing the league again," he said. "I'm trying." "You hear about the article?" "Yeah." "You think they're bluffing?" Anthony shook his head. No one bluffs with my father's name. Frank nodded slowly. Good. Then you'll listen to me. He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small envelope. Anthony opened it. Inside, a photo of him walking out of his apartment, taken from a rooftop, crosshairs drawn in pen. Anthony looked up. Frank's voice was cold. They've greenlit you. Anthony felt nothing at first. No fear. Just something sharp behind his ribs, something tightening. Why are you telling me this? Frank dropped the cigarette, crushed it beneath his heel. Because I was there the day your father made Benny. I stood next to him. I gave him my blessing. That was my mistake. Anthony's voice dropped. Why now? Because I've buried too many sons. He looked out at the water. You got two choices, kid. You disappear, or you strike back. Anthony stared at the photo, then folded it and put it in his pocket. I don't run. Frank gave a grim smile. Then I hope you're faster than the last man who said that. That night, Anthony went to the hospital again, sat beside his father. Alone. No Lucille, no doctors, just him. He leaned in close. I always thought I was just trying to save your name, he whispered. But I'm not. I'm trying to live up to it. He pulled out the photo, placed it in Joe's hand. I know you're in there. I know you'd burn the city down for this. Joe didn't move, didn't blink, but Anthony still waited. Waited for something. Anything. Just a flicker. Just once. Nothing came. 2 blocks away, in a black van, a man loaded a silenced pistol and checked his watch. Anthony's shoes echoed down the hospital hallway long after visiting hours ended. The staff let him stay. They knew who he was. They knew who his father was. And most of all, they knew the weight he carried, the kind that didn't show on his shoulders, but in his eyes. Room 607 hadn't changed. Same walls, same beeping, same motionless man in the bed. Joseph Colombo breathing by machine, head tilted ever so slightly to the right, eyes open, unseeing. Anthony stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. He closed the door behind him, sat down beside the bed. I know you can't say anything, he whispered, but I need you to hear this, and maybe knowing it will do something. Maybe it'll wake something up. He leaned in closer. They greenlit me. No response. Benny's behind it. Frank told me. They're sending someone. Could be tonight, could be next week. His voice lowered to a near whisper. And I'm not running. 2 blocks away, in a parked van, the man who'd been following Anthony for days opened the side panel and stepped out. Black coat, black gloves, black bag in hand. He wasn't flashy, wasn't known. That was the point. No one knew his name. That's why they used him. He didn't need instructions. He'd already scoped the hospital twice. Entry point, stairwell at the rear. Target, room 607. Objective, 1 clean shot. No survivors, no sound, no witnesses. In and out in under 3 minutes. Back in the room, Anthony stood now, pacing slowly. He couldn't sit anymore. I used to think your enemies were the press, the government, the other families. But I was wrong, he said, looking down at his father. Your enemies were the people who sat beside you, smiled in your face, kissed your hand. He walked to the window, looked out at the dim city skyline. They're the ones who shot you. Maybe not with bullets, but with silence, with betrayal. He turned around. I know now why you kept fighting. Because this thing we're in, this name, it doesn't let us die clean. The hitman slipped into the stairwell, moving like a shadow. 2 flights up, no cameras, no sound. The hallway was mostly dark. He moved to the door marked 6, checked the silencer, pulled it tight, then eased the door open with practiced silent precision. Room 607 was at the end of the hall. He began walking, slow, deliberate, inside the room. Anthony's back was to the door. He didn't hear the footsteps, didn't see the door open slowly behind him, didn't feel the shift in the air. But Joe did. His left hand twitched, barely visible. His finger moved, then his mouth parted, the faintest gasp of air escaping. A breath, A broken sound, not a word, but enough. Anthony turned, saw the door move, saw the figure step in, gloved, silent, gun raised. He didn't think. He launched forward, knocking the tray table over just as the first shot fired. The silencer hissed, but the impact was real. A burst of sharp pain tore across Anthony's left side, near the ribs, and sent him sprawling. The hitman moved fast, stepping forward to finish the job, but Joe's monitor spiked. An alarm began to beep, loud and urgent. The door flew open behind them, two nurses, confused, wide-eyed. The hitman hesitated. Just 1 second. But it was enough. Anthony, bleeding but still conscious, grabbed the overturned metal IV stand and swung it blindly. It connected with the man's wrist, cracking bone, and the gun skittered across the floor. Screams filled the hallway. The man turned to run, clutching his arm, vanishing out the door before security could react. Anthony slumped to the floor, gasping. Blood soaked his side. His eyes fluttered. The last thing he saw before blacking out was his father's face, still motionless. But those eyes, they were blinking. Lucille sat on her front porch the next morning when Frank pulled up. He didn't even have to say it. She stood slowly. He's dead? Frank shook his head. He's alive. She didn't move. He took one to the ribs, not fatal. They said if it had been an inch higher. She closed her eyes. Hospital? She asked. Frank nodded. Same room. Lucille looked at the rising sun and whispered, Of course. In the new wing of Roosevelt Hospital, room 607 was under heavy guard now. 2 cops at the door, cameras in the hallway. Inside, Anthony lay in a second bed, pale but stable, tubes running into his arm, bandages wrapped tight across his ribs. He opened his eyes slowly. The pain was like heat under the skin, sharp but distant. He turned his head. Joe was still there, still breathing, still silent. Anthony didn't try to speak. He just nodded once, to no one, as if accepting something. Later that evening, Ralph came to see him, sat in the chair beside his bed. You understand what this is now? Ralph asked. Anthony didn't answer. You made a move, a loud one, and now you've made them look weak. Still, Anthony didn't speak. Ralph leaned closer. They're going to keep coming, because this time they can't miss. Anthony finally turned his head. His voice was a whisper. I want a meeting. Ralph blinked. What kind of meeting? Anthony's eyes hardened. With Benny, face to face. No guards, no guns, just words. Ralph laughed bitterly. You think he'll come? Anthony nodded. He won't say no to a dying man. The meeting was set 2 days later. Neutral ground. An old church in Queens, long abandoned. Frank vouched for it. No windows, one entrance. Soundproof basement. Nothing modern, nothing wired. Anthony arrived alone, still bandaged, still pale, but upright and calm. Benny came with 2 men, left them at the door, as agreed. He stepped inside, suit pressed, tie knotted, the illusion of respect. You've got guts, he said, walking up to Anthony. Anthony didn't smile. You missed, Benny shrugged. Wasn't me. No, Anthony said. You never pulled the trigger yourself. Benny looked around. You gonna record this? Nope. Then say what you came to say. Anthony took a breath. I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm not asking for protection. I'm telling you, the League's coming back, with or without your approval. Benny chuckled. And how exactly do you plan to keep it alive when you can't even keep yourself alive? Anthony stepped closer. I'll bleed it into existence if I have to. You think people fear your name? They don't. They forgot you the second my father hit the ground. Benny's jaw clenched. You think that makes you safe? No, Anthony replied, but it makes me useful. And in this world, useful buys more time than fear. Benny stared at him, long and hard, then said quietly, You're going to die for this. Anthony nodded. Maybe. Then turned around and walked out. That night, Colombo's name spread again, this time not in the papers, but in the streets. Old members of the League began whispering. A few showed up at the hospital with flowers, asking if they could volunteer again. A man who once worked security at Joe's rallies stood outside room 607 for 4 hours just to make sure no one else tried anything. Even Frank saw it. The city remembered. And deep in the quiet of that hospital room, as Anthony slept and the world outside shifted again, Joseph Colombo blinked. Not a spasm, not a reflex, a blink. Then his fingers twitched, and his heart monitor ticked one beat faster. It happened slowly, not like the movies. No dramatic gasp, no sudden jolt upright, just a long, labored blink. Then another. The sound came next. Dull at first, muted, like underwater. The soft, rhythmic beeping of the monitors, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of old pipes in the hospital wall. Joe Colombo's eyes fluttered open in room 607, the room he'd been locked in for over a year. And the first thing he saw wasn't a face, or a cross, or the face of God. It was the cracked ceiling tile above his bed. He blinked again, and again, slowly. But this time, with intent. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was dry, like sandpaper. His body didn't move yet. Couldn't. But his mind was awake now, foggy, but aware. Alive. Lucille was the first to notice. She'd just walked into the room with her morning coffee, expecting the usual. Stillness, silence, the mechanical sigh of artificial breath. But today, something was off. Not wrong, just different. She paused at the doorway, stared at her husband, then took one careful step closer. Joe? No movement, no sound. She leaned in. Joseph. And that's when she saw it, his eyes, wide open now, focused, blinking slowly. Lucille dropped the coffee. The cup shattered on the floor. She pressed the red nurse call button with shaking hands, and for the first time in over a year, she felt terror and hope rush her heart at the same time. Anthony was across town when the call came. He answered on the second ring, expecting more news about the league or another reporter request. But the voice on the line wasn't calm. It was urgent, breathless. Your father's awake. The hospital room filled fast. Doctors, nurses, technicians. One spoke to Joe slowly, enunciating every word like he was a child. Can you hear me, Mr. Colombo? If yes, blink twice. He blinked twice. Lucille sobbed quietly behind her hand. Anthony arrived 15 minutes later. He walked into the room, staring at his father's eyes, not just open, but focused. Not just moving, but following him as he crossed the room. He pulled up a chair, sat down. Pop? A long silence. Joe's lips didn't move, but his eyes blinked again, once, then twice. Anthony smiled, but it was a sad smile, like someone seeing a ghost. The doctors were cautious. They called it minimal consciousness. They said he was still fragile, still mostly paralyzed, still unable to speak. But his brain activity had spiked. His reflexes were returning. And most important of all, he was back. Lucille never left his side for the next 72 hours. Anthony stayed at night, reading to him from the folder of old league speeches, stopping every so often just to watch for the blinks. Joe never spoke, but he never stopped listening. News traveled fast, faster than anyone expected. Colombo awakens from year-long coma. Mafia boss turned rights leader alive and conscious. Is Joseph Colombo the key to New York's mob war? Cameras returned to Roosevelt Hospital like vultures circling fresh meat. Old enemies turned quiet. Old allies grew nervous. And men in suits, the kind with government clearance and cold smiles, began requesting meetings. Inside the walls of power, Joe's awakening wasn't seen as a miracle. It was seen as a problem. He was a man with too much history, too many secrets, and one hell of a motive for revenge. The FBI scheduled a discreet visit. The order came from up high. No media, no questions, no pressure, just observe. See if he could talk, see if he would flip. But Colombo had always known how to play the long game. He didn't give them anything, not even a look. He just stared at the ceiling until they left. Meanwhile, Bonifacio panicked. He'd bet everything on Joe staying buried inside his own body. Had built an entire shadow command based on the man never returning. But now he was awake, breathing, and watching. That made him dangerous. Benny met with Carlo's people in a closed bar in Staten Island. "We need to act fast," he said, voice tight. "If he speaks, we're done. Half the commission could go down." The room stayed quiet. One man, old and scarred, finally said, "You want to kill a hospital patient? One under federal protection? You want to finish what Jerome Johnson couldn't?" Benny leaned forward. "I want to protect what we've built." The old man shook his head. "What you built, Benny, was on sand." Anthony saw the pressure building. Every news report about his father's return came with a new whisper, a new threat, a new twist. And now, people were questioning the League again. Was Joe really a symbol of justice, or just another boss trying to clean his legacy? Even some of Anthony's supporters started backing off. "He's awake," one donor said on the phone. "But is he clean?" Anthony didn't answer that question, because he didn't know anymore. One night, around midnight, Anthony sat alone in room 607. Joe was asleep, or appeared to be. Anthony stared at him. The man who raised him. The man who taught him to never back down. The man who'd let blood and bullets circle his family for a dream he could never quite define. "I thought I was doing this for you," Anthony whispered. "But I think I've been trying to outrun you." He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the glowing skyline. "I need to know the truth, Pop. Not what you told the world. Not the press version, the real version. Why did you start the League? Was it protection? Was it pride?" Silence. Then a sound, a low rasp. Anthony turned. Joe's lips had moved. Again, a breath, a shape, a word. "Legacy." Barely audible. Ripped from a throat that hadn't spoken in over a year. Anthony froze. Tears welled up before he even realized. "You said... legacy?" Joe blinked once, then twice. Then fell back into stillness. Doctors were stunned the next morning. One word. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Colombo wasn't just conscious, he was communicating. That changed everything. By the end of the week, Joe had a speech therapist. By the next, he could say 3 words. Water. Lucille. Enough. It was slow, but it was progress, and it was dangerous. The FBI came back, this time with more smiles, softer tones, offers of witness protection, sealed immunity, anything he wanted. All they wanted was a name, just one name. Colombo didn't say a word. They left empty-handed, but not happy. Anthony received a visitor outside the hospital, Frank. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were sharp. "You think you're winning," Frank said. Anthony stayed quiet. "But this ain't a game. It never was." "What are you saying?" Frank glanced up at the windows. "If he talks too loud, they'll come back. And next time, they won't miss." Anthony's jaw tightened. "He won't flip." Frank gave a dry laugh. "He doesn't have to. Just existing is enough." Anthony returned to room 607. Joe was awake, eyes on him. "You ever think," Anthony said slowly, "that maybe they needed you silent more than they needed you dead?" Joe blinked, then rasped out, "Still here." Anthony nodded, then whispered, "For how long?" The morning he finally spoke more than a word. It was raining. Lucille sat by the window, watching droplets race each other down the pane, while a nurse adjusted Joe's IV line. Anthony had stepped out to take a call, a reporter again, pressing him for an interview, wanting to know if Joe would be making a public statement soon. Lucille had rolled her eyes at that. Joe could barely swallow without help, but the world already expected a quote. The nurse stepped out quietly, and for a moment it was just Lucille and Joe again, like it had been in the beginning. Before the power, before the attention, before the coma, before the bullets. She looked at him, the way his face had thinned, how the sharp edges of age had carved into his cheekbones, how his once commanding jaw now trembled when he tried to move it. Still, the eyes were there. That same fire, that same watching, that same waiting. He turned to her slowly, his lips parted. Lucille leaned in, and he whispered, gravel-voiced, low, "He's not ready." Lucille blinked. "Anthony?" A slow nod. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. By that afternoon, Joe was sitting up. assisted by 2 nurses and a harness system that looked more like scaffolding than medical equipment. He was thin, bones showing through skin, but upright. Anthony stood across from him, stunned. Joe stared at him with tired, steady eyes. "Son," he rasped, "you got hit." Anthony smiled despite the ache in his ribs. "You're catching up." Joe coughed, a dry, broken sound, but his smile tried to form too. Anthony stepped forward. "You remember what happened?" Joe nodded. "Everything?" Another nod. Then, slowly, "I saw him." Anthony paused. "Who?" Joe's jaw moved, but the words didn't come easy. Finally, "Shooter. Black. Not alone." Anthony stiffened. He'd heard rumors, but hearing it from Joe, this was different. "You know who sent him?" Joe looked down, then back up. "You're not ready for that." The FBI came again. Same smiles, softer voices. They were offering more now. Full immunity, relocation for his family, a book deal even. All Joe had to do was talk. Just tell them who sanctioned the hit. Just confirm the families involved. Just give them a piece of the map. Joe leaned forward slightly, voice hoarse but clear. "When I was silent, you wanted me to talk. Now that I talk, you'll want me silent again." They didn't smile after that. The agents left. Less friendly, more focused. Joe had become a problem again. Later that night, Lucille sat beside him in the half-light of the hospital room. Joe looked tired, but something in him buzzed now, a kind of cold awareness that hadn't been there since before the shooting. Lucille said quietly, "You know they'll kill him too, right? If you start talking. If you bring the heat again." Joe nodded once. "I talk. Anthony burns." Lucille placed her hand on his. "So don't talk." Joe stared at the ceiling, then said, "I tried silence. They shot me anyway." 2 days later, the press got wind that Joe had spoken full sentences. The leak didn't come from the hospital. It came from a wire inside the FBI. The news hit like a bomb. "Colombo speaks. Investigation reopened. The comeback no one saw coming. Mob royalty wakes up, world holds breath." And suddenly, everyone had a microphone again. Talk shows debated his next move. Senators made statements. Old gangsters went into hiding. And Benny Fazio? He called for a sit-down. They met in a private club in Midtown. Not Joe and Benny. Anthony and Benny. Joe was still too weak to move from the hospital, but he sent a message through his son. Benny arrived in a black sedan with 2 men who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Anthony came alone, still bruised from his own bullet, still standing. Benny didn't waste time. "You're gonna make me kill you again, aren't you?" Anthony didn't blink. "You missed once." Benny leaned back in the booth. The place was empty except for them. "Your old man's awake. Big news, headlines, cops, feds. You think that's strength? It's a death sentence for all of us." Anthony said nothing. Benny continued. "I gave you a pass because you were grieving. I let you flap your mouth, hold your little rallies, build your fantasy league. But this is betrayal." Anthony leaned forward now. "No, Benny, this is memory, and you hate it, because memory means people start asking who ordered the hit." Benny didn't smile anymore. Anthony stood. "You wanted him silent forever. He's not. Deal with it." That night, someone tossed a Molotov cocktail at the back wall of the league office. No one was inside, but the message was clear. The war was starting again. Frank called Anthony the next day. "You're pushing too hard." Anthony was sitting by his father's bedside, watching him sleep. "I'm not pushing. I'm holding the line. You need to pull back." "I can't." "Then he needs to." Anthony looked down. "I don't think he wants to anymore." That night, Joe woke just past midnight. The room was dark, save for the monitors blinking. Lucille was asleep in the chair. Anthony wasn't there. Joe turned his head toward the ceiling and whispered a single word. "Ready?" The next morning, Joe requested a priest. The hospital sent one from the diocese, mid-50s, kind eyes, spoke with an Irish lilt. Joe didn't want confession. He wanted something else. "Final words?" the priest asked gently. No, Joe said. Not final. Just true. The priest sat. Joe spoke slowly, painfully, but clearly. I started the League to protect the name, not the people. The name. He paused, breathed shallow. It became real, only after the blood. Before that, it was a shield. The priest said nothing. Joe continued. I thought legacy meant power. Now I know. It means memory. Memory is heavier. The priest asked softly, what do you want me to do with this truth? Joe closed his eyes, then opened them. Survive it. By week's end, Joe had regained partial control of his hands and tongue, enough to speak fully, enough to name names. He didn't, not yet, but the world waited. Outside the hospital, the press camped like wolves. Inside, Anthony and Lucille stayed close, but one nurse noticed something. A man in a gray suit had walked past room 607 3 times in one night. He wasn't staff, wasn't media, wasn't family. And when security tried to question him, he was gone. That night, Frank showed up again. This time, he didn't sit. He stood over Joe's bed. You're a ghost that talks now, Frank said quietly. And that's dangerous. Joe looked at him. I've always been dangerous. Frank nodded. You sure you want to burn it all down now, old man? Joe stared at the ceiling. Then said, what's left to save? The camera crew arrived at 8:15 a.m. 3 of them, all approved, all carefully vetted. One cameraman, one audio tech, one producer from a small independent channel with no ties to the major networks or government offices. Anthony chose them specifically. He didn't want CNN. He didn't want CBS. He didn't want spin. He wanted the raw truth. By 8:35, they had the lights set up in room 607. The blinds closed, the background silent, the medical equipment muffled as best as possible. Joe sat propped up in his hospital bed, IV in one arm, oxygen line in his nose, throat dry but mind sharp. Lucille was in the hallway, pacing like a woman preparing to lose something she'd only just gotten back. Anthony stood near the door, watching. Joe looked straight into the camera, didn't blink, didn't hesitate. And when the red light went on, he spoke. My name is Joseph Colombo, voice weak but steady, a low rasp that rumbled like thunder through a tunnel. I was shot in the street, in front of my sons, in front of my people, in front of the country, and they called it justice, or karma, or coincidence. A pause. But I'm still here. Another breath, shallow, deliberate. And I've got something to say. Outside, no one knew the camera was rolling, but across the city, in social clubs, offices, unmarked vans, phones buzzed, texts were sent, streets paused, someone was leaking it live. The footage went up within minutes, raw, unfiltered, streaming to thousands in real time. And suddenly, a dying man's voice became the loudest thing in New York. I started the Italian-American Civil Rights League to protect our name. That's the truth. It wasn't about justice at first. It was about reputation, image. Because I got tired of being called a criminal every time someone said my last name. His fingers clenched the sheet. They said we were all mobsters. All thugs, all liars. Even the ones who never picked up a bat or a gun. Even the kids trying to get jobs, trying to go to school, trying to make something. He coughed. The mic picked it up. Anthony stepped forward. Joe raised his hand. He wasn't done. But something happened. Something changed. When I started speaking for pride, I started seeing pain. And not just from Italians, from black men, Latinos, immigrants, people who'd been told to shut up, sit down, and disappear. He leaned forward slightly. And I realized this country didn't care if you worked hard. It only cared if you stayed quiet. In a dark corner bar in Staten Island, Benny Fazio watched the live stream on a burner phone. He didn't speak, just drank his coffee and stared at the screen. Next to him, one of his men muttered, "Should have finished him." Benny didn't reply. Back in room 607, the world's attention was silent and sharp as a blade. Joe Colombo kept going. I'm no saint. I've hurt people. I've made choices I can't undo. But I never lied about who I was. I never pretended to be clean. I just wanted a seat at the table for my people, and when I got it, they put a bullet in my back." He coughed again, harder this time. Lucille turned away from the hallway glass. Anthony's fists clenched. Joe raised a trembling finger, still not done. "I'm alive today because I was supposed to die, because they missed, and now I'm speaking again because I don't have much time. So here's what you need to know." His voice hardened, just a touch. "I know who shot me." Gasps in rooms across the city. Phones buzzed, voices whispered. Anthony stepped closer, instinct kicking in, but Joe didn't flinch. "They used a black man to pull the trigger, so the headlines would say it was about race, so the league would fall with me, so the people would eat each other in the confusion, and it almost worked." Silence. No name. But everyone listening knew what he was saying. In an FBI office downtown, an agent stood from his desk and muttered, "Shut it down." Another replied. Too late. Joe exhaled, deep, labored. "This city eats men like me, then sells their bones as stories." He looked into the camera, eyes sharp now, focused. "But I ain't a story yet." The live stream ended at 9:02 a.m. The footage went viral within minutes. Clips posted, quotes pulled, reactions boiling. Colombo names the game, not the shooter. Civil rights or final confession? Mob icon speaks, city reacts. Within the hour, every major news outlet was circling the hospital. And inside, Colombo lay back on the bed, eyes closed, breathing heavier than before. Lucille wiped his face with a cold towel. "You did it," she whispered. Joe didn't reply. Across town, Benny stood at the edge of a rooftop with two of his crew. "He didn't name you," one said. Benny was quiet. "He didn't say your name." Still quiet. Then Benny muttered, "That was the threat." By noon, Anthony was on every call list in New York. Reporters, activists, politicians, even a movie studio. He ignored them all. Instead, he sat at his father's side, holding a cold, thin hand that used to knock men unconscious with a single slap. "You know they'll come for us harder now, right?" he said. Joe's lips moved. "Let them." But behind the walls, something was shifting. The families were divided. Some believed Joe had gone soft, that he'd die before giving up anything real. Others believed he had a list, names, dates, crimes, ready to pass to the feds. And one man, in a penthouse suite far above the noise, picked up a phone and said, "One more bullet, this time not in the back." That night, two men tried to get into Roosevelt Hospital. Fake uniforms, real weapons. They made it through the first checkpoint. They didn't make it past the second. A silent alarm had been triggered by Anthony himself. When the men were taken down, one of them had a note in his pocket. It didn't have Joe's name on it. It had Anthony's. Back in room 607, Joe watched the flashing red lights outside his window, then turned to his son. "Legacy," he said, voice cracking. Anthony leaned closer. "What about it?" Joe gripped his son's wrist, harder than expected. "It's not what you leave behind. It's what you fight to keep." The hospital had become a fortress. Metal detectors, armed officers, undercover agents planted in the halls, cameras at every entrance. Visitor logs checked twice. Room 607 was no longer a recovery ward. It was a bunker. Joe Colombo had become something more than a man now, a target too famous to kill quietly and too dangerous to keep alive. But the danger wasn't outside. It was walking around inside, smiling, shaking hands. And Joe knew it. He just didn't know who. Not yet. Anthony stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear. "You hear about the two fake orderlies?" he asked. Frank's voice came in over the line, rough and quiet. "Yeah, I'm hearing they were hired local, no connection to the old families, real nobodies. Somebody gave them Joe's location." Frank didn't respond. Anthony watched the skyline a moment. Then, "It's someone close." That night, Joe stared at the ceiling while Lucille read from a Bible she barely believed in anymore. He blinked. She stopped. He rasped, "He's in the house." Lucille turned to him. "Who?" Joe's eyes narrowed. "He eats with us." 2 days later, Anthony received a call from a burner number. The voice on the other end was disguised, that deepened, electronic, unnatural. "You're making a mess, Colombo. A dangerous one. Step away or get buried." Anthony chuckled. "I've already been shot. This is the second act." "You won't get a third." Click. By now, the media was swarming the league office, asking if Joe would give another statement. Anthony refused. "He's not ready." He wasn't lying. Joe had spoken once, loud enough for the world to hear, but the weight of it drained him. Every breath cost him more now. His body was failing, even as his mind sharpened. But there was one thing left he had to say, and only one man he had to say it to. Ralph Esposito, old consigliere, loyal, quiet, invisible. Joe requested him by name. The nurses called. Ralph showed up the next afternoon wearing black gloves and a thick coat, even though the sun outside was sharp and unseasonably warm. He entered room 607 and closed the door behind him. Anthony watched from the hallway, unease crawling under his skin. Inside, Ralph sat in the chair beside Joe, just like he had for 30 years. Just like the old days. "Look at you," he said softly. "They tried to put you in the ground, and you still won't stay down." Joe blinked once, then rasped, "Why'd you do it?" Ralph didn't answer. Joe's gaze didn't break. "You were there when I started the league. You were there when they shot me. You were there when my son got hit." Still, Ralph said nothing. Then Joe spoke again, this time louder. "You were there because you planned it." Outside, Anthony tensed. Lucille turned sharply toward the door. Inside, Ralph finally spoke. "You got soft, Joe." His voice had changed. The mask was off. "You started making speeches, you made yourself a headline, and you made the rest of us targets." Joe coughed, pain flaring up his chest, but his eyes stayed locked on Ralph. "You sold me." Ralph shook his head slowly. "No, I protected the order. You were burning the whole thing down for pride. You forgot what kept us alive all these years. Silence, loyalty, darkness. You put a spotlight on a graveyard." Joe's voice was barely a whisper now. "You sold me to Benny." Ralph smiled. "I gave him the name. He gave me the future." Anthony burst into the room. Ralph stood fast, hand inside his coat. Anthony's gun was already drawn. "You want to die here?" he said, voice trembling. Ralph didn't flinch. "I should have killed you when I had the chance," he muttered. Joe raised a hand. The motion was small, shaking. But Ralph saw it. Joe was calling him back, not with anger, with judgment. "You broke bread with me," Joe whispered. "You held my children. You buried my enemies. You were my brother." Ralph looked away, then said with something close to regret, "And that's why I spared your life that day. But I should have finished it." Frank entered next. He didn't knock. He saw Ralph, saw Anthony, saw the gun, and didn't ask a single question. "Get him out of here," Frank said. 2 plainclothes officers entered moments later. Ralph didn't fight, didn't curse. He walked out in cuffs, silent as a man who knew he'd never see the sky again. Anthony collapsed into the chair beside Joe. He didn't speak for a full minute. When he finally did, it came out flat. He was family. Joe's lips cracked open. So was Judas. Later that night, Anthony stood outside the hospital, alone. Frank joined him, hands in his coat, silent. They both stared at the same skyline Joe had once ruled. "They'll try again," Anthony said. Frank nodded. "And next time?" "Won't be a hospital bed," Frank replied. "It'll be a funeral." Anthony lit a cigarette, the first in weeks. He didn't even smoke it, just let it burn between his fingers. "I need to finish this." Frank turned to him. "You will." Anthony looked up at the hospital window. "But not for him," he said. Frank frowned. "Then who?" Anthony dropped the cigarette. "For the name." Inside, Joe lay in the dark, eyes open. The nurse thought he was asleep. She turned off the monitor alarm, closed the blinds, left the room. Joe blinked once, then stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Forgive me." The sky was gray the morning Joseph Colombo died. No rain, no wind, just that strange New York kind of silence, heavy, hanging like breath before a punch. Room 607 was quiet too, not because they weren't expecting it, but because they were. Joe had stopped speaking 3 days earlier, stopped blinking the day before. By the time the nurse came in and saw the flatline on the monitor, there wasn't panic, no alarms, no rush of doctors, no emergency crash cart, just a man who had finally run out of time, and breath, and fight. Lucille didn't cry. She sat beside him like she had every morning for the past year, rubbing the thin skin of his hand with her thumb, whispering something only she and God would ever know. Anthony didn't say anything either. He arrived 10 minutes later, stood at the foot of the bed and just looked at his father. Not at the tubes, not at the body, just the face. Still, pale, but at peace, or close enough. The press got wind within the hour. By noon, it was everywhere. Joseph Colombo dies at 54. Mafia Don turned civil rights leader passes quietly, from crime to cause, the complicated life of Colombo. Some called him a visionary. Others called him a fraud. A few just called him a gangster who knew how to play politics. Anthony didn't respond to a single reporter, didn't hold a press conference, didn't tweet, didn't post. He just went home. The funeral was closed casket, held in the old Bensonhurst church where Joe used to sit in the back row, always in the shadows, always watching but never bowing. Only a few family members showed. Frank, Lucille, some quiet faces from the old days. Men who came alone, wore black, and said nothing. The League tried to send flowers. Anthony had them returned. This wasn't about the League anymore. Not today. Later that night, Anthony sat alone in the League office. The lights were low. A single desk lamp buzzed softly above him. On the table was a box, small, heavy, sealed tight. Frank had handed it to him after the burial. "He left it for you," Frank had said. He said not to open it until after he was gone. Anthony stared at it now, his father's handwriting on the top, for the name. He opened it slowly. Inside was a stack of old notebooks, small, leather-bound, worn with age. The first page of the first book had just 4 words scrawled in ink. Everything I never said. It wasn't a confession, it was a reckoning. Joe had written everything, who he trusted, who betrayed him, what he built, and what he destroyed. There were names, dates, secrets, but there were also thoughts, private ones, vulnerable ones, ones Anthony never imagined his father would write down. I lied to protect the family. Then I lied to protect myself. Then I lied because I didn't know how to stop. I watched the world change and thought I could change with it. I was wrong. My name is a crown and a curse. Anthony read through the pages for hours. His father didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't beg to be remembered kindly. He simply told the truth, the raw, unsellable truth. And by the time Anthony closed the final book, the sun was rising. A week passed. Then 2. The media moved on. The League offices grew quiet again. But something had shifted. A new generation of Italian Americans and black activists who had once seen Colombo's movement as nothing more than a mob shield began talking again. Small meetings, quiet dinners. Anthony didn't lead them. He didn't preach. He just listened. One afternoon, a young man approached him outside the old League building. He couldn't have been older than 25. "Are you his son?" he asked. Anthony nodded. The kid shifted awkwardly. "My grandfather. He used to march with the League. He said your dad gave him his first paycheck." Anthony smiled faintly. "He probably gave him his last, too." They both laughed. Then the kid asked something Anthony hadn't expected. "Is it true what he said? That he started it for the name, not the people?" Anthony thought about it. About the books, the blood, the silence, the whisper in his father's voice when he said legacy isn't what you build, it's what survives you. Finally, Anthony said, "Yeah, but somewhere along the way, he realized people are the name. And the name doesn't mean anything if no one's left standing under it." The kid nodded. "Good answer." He left, and Anthony stood there, feeling something new. Stillness, without guilt, without fear, just stillness. A year later, the League returned, but not the way people expected. No podiums, no media stunts, just quiet outreach, legal aid, community support, scholarships, no flags, no names. It was still Joe's dream, but it didn't need his face anymore. And that was the point. Anthony sat on the Brooklyn pier that fall, a cool wind brushing the back of his neck. He opened his father's last notebook. The final page had a single line. "Tell them I didn't change the world, just made noise long enough for someone else to." Anthony smiled, then closed the book, put it back in the box, and whispered, "To no one and to everyone, you did, Pop, more than you'll ever know."